Welcome back. There was a man in this village that no one prayed for. Not because they forgot him. Not because they didn't know his name. But because they believed God had already finished with him. They said some souls refuse mercy. They said some doors close forever. They said praying for him was pointless. And then Saint Francis arrived. No one knew when it started. At some point, the man stopped being a neighbor and became a warning. Parents pulled their children closer when he passed. Merchants watched their goods when he lingered. Men whispered that evil followed him like a shadow. When he entered the church, the pews emptied around him. And yet, he kept coming. Every week. Every prayer. He sat in the same place. Never moved forward. Never spoke. People noticed something unsettling. A man everyone believed was damned. Was still coming to God. Over time, the village agreed on something without ever saying it aloud. They would not help him. They would not confront him. They would not pray for him. They called it wisdom. If God wanted him saved, they said, he would have changed by now. What they didn't realize was that they had done something dangerous. They had taken God's place. When Saint Francis entered the village, the people welcomed him warmly. They brought bread. They asked for blessings. They asked him to speak about mercy. But Francis noticed what they avoided. A man sitting alone. Eyes lowered. Hands clenched. Francis watched him for days. And then Francis did something that unsettled everyone. He asked about him. The answers came quickly, too quickly. Do not trouble yourself with him. He does not wish to change. He has rejected grace. Francis said nothing. But that night, he did not sleep. Francis knelt in the dark chapel long after the village slept. He did not pray for healing. He did not pray for signs. He prayed one sentence. Lord, am I wrong to fear him? The answer did not come as a voice. It came as a weight. Francis understood something that frightened him. The man was not dangerous because of what he had done. He was dangerous because of what would happen if no one believed mercy still applied to him. The next morning, Francis walked alone beyond the village. He found the man where everyone said he would be. On the edge. When the man saw Francis, his face hardened. You shouldn't be here, he said. They don't like it when you speak to me. Francis sat anyway. Silence stretched. Finally, the man spoke the truth no one else had heard. I stopped asking God to forgive me, he said. Because everyone else already decided he wouldn't. Francis did not argue. He did not correct. He did not preach. He waited. Then he spoke one sentence, quietly, deliberately. God never asked them to decide that. The man froze. Francis continued. You may be guilty. You may be broken. But you are not abandoned. Something in the man collapsed. Not loudly. Not suddenly. But completely. The man did not run to confession that day. Francis did not demand it. Instead, Francis walked with him. They prayed together, briefly. They spoke, carefully. They waited. That night, for the first time in years, the man asked God for mercy. Not because he felt worthy. But because someone reminded him that God still listened. When the man returned to church, Francis walked beside him. No explanation was given. No forgiveness announced. But everyone saw it. And everyone felt something uncomfortable. Because the man they had written off had been welcomed by God. This story is difficult because it asks a dangerous question. Not about the man, but about the village. How many people do we stop praying for because we believe we know the outcome? How often do we confuse judgment with discernment? Saint Francis understood something few people want to admit. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to mercy is not sin, but certainty. This story does not end with celebration. There is no moment where the village gathers in joy. No applause. No sudden transformation that makes everything feel resolved. Because the most difficult part of this story is not what happened to the man everyone hated. It is what happened to everyone else. Saint Francis understood something that most people never pause to consider. That the greatest danger to the soul is not always obvious sin. It is not violence. It is not scandal. Sometimes, the greatest danger is certainty. The certainty that someone else is beyond hope. The certainty that God has already finished His work. The certainty that mercy has limits, and that we know where those limits are. The people in the village believed they were being realistic. They believed they were protecting themselves, their families, their peace. But without realizing it, they committed a quieter sin. They stopped hoping for another soul. And when hope dies, prayer dies with it. Saint Francis never defended the man's actions. He never minimized his guilt. He never suggested that sin does not matter. What Francis refused to do was something far more radical. He refused to agree that God had stopped waiting. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for us. Because most of us have someone we have quietly removed from our prayers. Not because we hate them, but because we are tired. Tired of disappointment. Tired of waiting. Tired of believing something will change when it never seems to. So we tell ourselves something that feels reasonable. They've chosen their path. They don't want God. There's nothing more that can be done. And maybe those words feel wise. But Saint Francis would ask a harder question. Who told us it was our place to decide when mercy ends? The man in this story did not change because Francis was persuasive. He did not change because Francis was holy. He changed because someone finally stood between him and despair. Because someone refused to let the silence convince him that God had abandoned him. And this reveals a frightening truth. Sometimes, people do not return to God because they believe God has already turned away. Not because He has. But because we acted as if He had. Francis understood that despair is not born in isolation. It grows where love is withdrawn. Where silence replaces prayer. Where judgment replaces hope. This is why Francis was so dangerous to the comfortable. Because he refused to let anyone be written off. He believed that the moment we stop praying for someone, we begin to resemble the very hardness we claim to oppose. And that is why this story lingers. Because it forces us to ask questions we would rather avoid. Who have we labeled as impossible? Who have we quietly decided is not worth the effort of prayer anymore? Who do we talk about as if God is finished with them? Saint Francis would say this gently, but firmly. The moment you stop praying for someone is the moment you stop trusting God's mercy. Forgiveness and hope are not rewards for good behavior. They are acts of obedience. Francis knew that loving the unlovable is not sentimental. It is costly. It risks disappointment. It risks humiliation. It risks being wrong. But he also knew this. Refusing to hope is safer. And far more dangerous. Because it hardens the heart of the one who refuses. This is why the story does not end with the man's redemption. It ends with a mirror. Held up to the village. Held up to us. The man everyone hated was never the greatest threat to that community. The greater danger was a group of faithful people. Slowly learning to believe that mercy had limits. Saint Francis stood against that belief with nothing but silence, patience, and one sentence spoken at the right moment. And that may be the most unsettling miracle of all. Because it means that God may still be waiting. In places we have already given up on. And the question that remains, long after the story ends, is this. When God is still waiting, will we wait with Him? Or will we decide the story is already over?